Welcome, everybody. This is a video that I was planning to do for a very long time, and I felt that this was the right moment to share with you some thoughts around the research that I have been conducting and my work, both in the clinical and the scientific research setting, which of course also informs the way I teach. Now, this will not be a lecture per se. It's simply a way for me to share some thoughts about what I consider to be a very important problem, not just within academia, but a problem that might affect society in a very negative way. The title might be somewhat misleading, as it might elicit some of those very strong emotions in individuals that might not necessarily agree with this or that specific definition, but I will try my best to be as inclusive and open-minded toward the different interpretation that specific aspects of reality have in the context of a better understanding of who we are as human beings. What is the topic? The topic is transgender issues, transgender ideology, transgender versus medicine, transgender inclusive of medicine, and a variety of other topics that I will do my best to analyze in a very specific way, despite of the fact that there is no possible way to sum up all the biological, all the scientific, neurological, sociological, psychological, and philosophical aspects of such a wonderful, profound, and complex topic. Very often I've been asked to provide scientific evidence for what the current state of affairs is regarding the concept of identity. Now, in my job, I try to differentiate between identity from a purely scientific standpoint, and by scientific standpoint, I usually identify the empirical, laboratory-based knowledge, and it's something that I'm more familiar with in comparison to other areas of human knowledge, but also making room for the philosophical, for the interpretation base, for the exegetical elements of identity. Identity can also be a very complex thing to describe because it might be assumed that it's a very subjective and or individual based concept. So how can we start our conversation today? Now, this conversation was motivated for a variety of reasons, some of which have to do with my clinical research, a research that I've been conducting for the last 20 years, a research that has to do with psychiatry, clinical psychology, sexology, biology, and to some minor extent, endocrinology and medicine in general. And it's a research that has morphed over the years, and I would say has morphed to the extent that it is a proper approach to have to discuss what the application of this research are currently in the scientific discourse, but also in a general population perspective. What is very surprising to me is that something that should be quite, I wouldn't say easy to understand, but quite precise in the way it's delivered is our current scientific knowledge, our current biological knowledge, more specifically, because we have a very solid way to assess that. Now, we are all human beings, we all make mistakes, and by no means I'm trying to say that scientists are always right in the way they approach such complex topics, but at least, at the very least, science progresses by trial and error. And so if, as I hope, the peer review process is solid enough and the scientific methods are still based on the principle of falsifiability, are still based on the golden standards of science, so meta-analysis and systematic review and randomized case control trial, double-blind, triple-blind trial, then it's a fair assumption to say that if there are mistakes, someone will catch them and will catch them properly with a proper discussion and really taking apart the mistakes that we do in science. Unfortunately, this has not really been the case, I would say, in the last, overall, I would say 5 to 10 years, which is really concerning to me because with my students, what I'm trying to do is always make sure that the research that's quoted is less than 6 or 7 years old. That's one of the standards when a student, a researcher, wants to provide scientific evidence to this or that topic. The general expectation is that the research upon which the claims are made should be very recent. And this is, to some extent, common sense. You don't want to rely on things that might be disproven by science, things that might be either completely or partially false or misinterpreted, or simply you don't want to rely on research that was predicated upon studies that did not have the current scientific base. And by that, I also mean technological base. For instance, in the field of neuroscience, we cannot claim that the same knowledge we had only 50 years ago in comparison to the current brain imaging-based knowledge was just as good. We have very solid theoretical framework, but we should always monitor those framework and compare them with the current state of affairs in the context of lab analysis. So we make mistakes. Scientists make mistakes. People make mistakes. We are all fallible, but of course, the principle of falsifiability also requires that we always reassess our knowledge. And this is something that I use the term believe. I always believe to be true. And to a very big extent, I still hold on to this truth because I still believe in the peer review process. I still believe in the scientific method. I could even argue that it's not a question of belief. In fact, one of the things that I very often say to my students is, while you're in the lab, the preferred standpoint will be probably a non-assumption standpoint. I would say an atheistic standpoint, not because the research we focus on has to have any claims of correlation to spirituality or religion, but simply because if it's the scientific method we want to apply, we should remove ourselves from any possible confounding element, any possible variable that we don't take into account. So I use the term atheistic in a broad philosophical way. We could also say agnostic, not just toward God or spirituality, but simply agnostic toward anything that cannot be easily verified. And by easily, I actually don't mean easily in the context of the way the study design is constructed, but simply in a way that is very specific in terms of what we are actually studying. Think about the yes no binary in mathematics, that 0 1 0 1, etc., which is really the basis of the null hypothesis in science, and everything else really is predicated upon them. Whether you're talking about the t-test, whether you're talking about p-values, all the way to ANOVA, all the statistical analysis and related methods are predicated upon the scientific method as we intended it. Unfortunately, what I have been noticing is that there is less and less knowledge from one perspective, and also more and more a political misrepresentation of data, which affects, unfortunately, both sides of the political spectrum, which in itself is an oxymoron, because in the United States, I feel we are suffering in particular, science is suffering in particular because of the big divide, the binary divide, really, that is contrary to a proper scientific investigation. In other countries, other countries might have the opposite problem. There are countries in Europe, for instance, that have like 50s, 70s parties, and it's really hard to define what each party wants to say besides, making sure that they are reelected. But it's more of a spectrum in comparison to this very artificial divide, because scientific issues are not political issues. But if we don't want to take into account the political or social application of scientific findings, then we might make the mistake to assume that science is always politics-free, which unfortunately it's not. And this is really hard for me to admit, because I always believed that those two were separate magisteria, but I can no longer remain silent, especially in regard to what science clearly demonstrated as false. So let's begin our discussion. Transgender ideology. Why would I use this term in the first place? Every time we talk about ideology, we usually think about a political or philosophical, pseudo-philosophical basis for a repression, a cognitive repression, a cultural repression, a improper modulation of the system of belief of a certain population. And so why would I apply that to the current situation, particularly in regard to sex and gender? Well, for the simple reason that I firmly believe that transgender ideology is extremely harmful to the general population, but even more so to transgender people. I would like to discuss this from the scientific standpoint, and then we'll venture into the more philosophical philosophical perspective in this regard. We could start from a simple question. How do we know what we know about ourselves? In my job, I usually answer this question on the basis of neuroscience, psychiatry, psychology, and medicine. This is, where most of my training and research activity is based, and I do not want to say that these are the only areas of science that we should base ourselves upon when we discuss gender issues, but it's a good place to start. I also don't want to claim that biology or neurology or neuroscience has all the answers, but at the very least has very precise answers within the realm of investigation that these fields have been studied for decades, for centuries. And contrary to what some poorly informed, I don't even know how to define them, poorly informed representatives of the current situation would like to say, science has not changed its very basic notions in regard to sex and gender. Absolutely not. What do we mean by sex and gender? Let's start from a very, very basic biological standpoint. If we want to investigate human sexuality, we should start with the 5 main areas. We should start with a basic karyotype, we should study chromosomes, we should start the investigation of gonadal activation, so gonads, sex glands. We should study hormones, so the endocrine system. We should start genitalia, and of course, the very last one of my favorites, I dare to say, the neuroscientific standpoint, including neurotransmitters, but also neuroanatomy, neural structure, neural function. In that sense, there is an overlapping magisteria between neuroanatomy and neural function. But let's start from a common misrepresentation. A common misrepresentation that, in my experience, usually came from what we could call the right-wing political spectrum. Namely the claim that there is only a binary understanding and therefore only a binary reality for chromosomes, and this binary reality is either XX or XY. Now, this is not true. It has not been proven by science to be true. We know this to be a false statement for decades. Now, I want to be very careful here, because when I say this is a claim made by the right-wing political spectrum, this is in itself a misnomer. First of all, because historically speaking, the historical right and the historical left are not necessarily a proper corresponding terms for what we see nowadays, especially in the United States. A good example would be the Republican Party in Europe, especially in Italy, for instance, where the Republican Party is definitely not right-wing. It would definitely be more associated with socialist, or to some extent even anarchist or even communist standpoint. So definitely not right-wing as in conservative traditionalist, unless if by tradition we mean the tradition of Marx and Engels, for instance, or the Republican Party in Ireland, and even more so in Northern Ireland. We have to be very, very careful. And I also don't like to talk about politics too much. The only reason why I'm bringing this to your attention is because very often science and politics merge together in a way that that doesn't help any of the aforementioned terms. Plus, something I want to be very, very clear is that I'm not allowing any politicians or political propaganda to use any of my research, not even this mini lecture, this mini conversation I'm having with you, to promote this or that political agenda. I'm completely against it. I do not belong and I don't want to belong to any political party. So if in the future you see any of the claims related to my research utilized in the context of a political agenda, please know that I did not approve of it. I also mention this because it has been brought to my attention by some colleague of mine that some of my research papers have been misrepresented, unfortunately, within the very area that I always support, which is the scientific academic arena. And they were misrepresented simply because they were misinterpreted from a very basic statistical and mathematical standpoint, but even more concerning from a philosophical standpoint. Why is this even more concerning? Because we can all make mistakes in mathematics and statistics. We can make mistakes in study design. We can make the mistakes in interpreting data. We can make mistakes in sheer calculation. And that's why the peer review process, yet again, is usually a guarantee of solid scientific evidence. But what I've noticed is that in those few cases where my research has been utilized by some to prove what biology actually does not prove at all, it really sounds to me that this has been done either due to a relatively poor ability to interpret scientific papers, which again, I'm really having a hard time believing that, because those very people that utilize that were not pop scientists, were not journalists. And by no means I mean to criticize journalism as a profession, but I'm not expecting a journalist to have the same theoretical and scientific knowledge to interpret a scientific paper as some of my colleagues in the lab. So I'm not quite sure if this can be missed. I'm more prone to think that this was done with the purpose of actually misinterpreting the data in order to support this or that claim, which unfortunately the data does not support at all. I also mention this because unfortunately, what I've noticed is that in areas that are usually less scientifically based, not because they're anti-scientific, but because they're not part of the, I would say, standard processes in academia. And those areas vary from education to pedagogical element to sociology, to some extent, unfortunately, to other social sciences such as counseling and psychology. And they are completely missing the point. And unfortunately, I'm using this word all the time during this lecture because I really feel bad about it. I don't actually think that those who misrepresent this type of research actually know what they're doing. I don't want to accuse them of being too gullible or naive or less cognitively able to understand the research, but I think that they're starting from a very good place in their hearts, a place where misconception about the science is at times utilized to make claims that are beyond what science actually has to say, but in most cases really against what science clearly states. So yet again, if you see any of my research utilized outside of academia or in the context of this or that political agenda, please know that I am not supporting this and I do not want to be representative of any political agenda. Now let's start again from what we usually think about transgender issues. And I think a proper place to start would be the place of neuroscience and biology in general medicine. So we already mentioned the big five chromosomes, gonads, hormones, genitalia, and neurotransmitters. And we also mentioned that it's a false assumption to think that human beings are only divided into XX or XY, feminine in the first case, and of course, masculine in the second case. This is false, which does not, however, disprove the fact that in the vast majority of cases, let me repeat it, in the vast majority of cases, and depending which research analysis you utilize, we're talking about 99-ish% of the cases of the general population. Most people will still be XX or XY in terms of their karyotype. In other cases, as we will see, variations such as XYY, XXX, XXY, XXXX, so triad or tetrad, X or XXXY, are variations on the chromosomal element, and those variations do not represent the biological norm. What do we mean by that? We have to be extremely careful in utilizing terms in their proper scientific context. When we use terms such as normal or abnormal, those are not judgments of value, ethics, or morals. We're talking about standard distribution. And even in that case, we have to be extremely careful, because whenever we think about the bell curve, some of you might be very familiar with some very poorly scientifically constructed claims with the bell curve regarding IQ and G, for instance, or differences in the application of genetic background and cognitive abilities. Okay, in other words, mathematically speaking, the bell curve, the normal distribution, is a solidly scientifically based artifact to discuss what we have. But in any case, from the perspective of science, this variation still falls within the normal binary sexual presentation. In other words, we have chromosomes that determine the function of gonads, of sex glands. And of course, when we talk about haploid cell, we talk about gametes, we talk about ovaries and testes, ovaries, ovum, and testes, sperm. But within the element of haploid cells, we have to really be careful not to misrepresent what science actually is stating. Science did not disprove the binary of sexuality in human beings. Quite the contrary. In fact, if we want to take into account a more evolutionary-based biological research, the comparison between anisogamy and isogamy actually purported the fact that the binary is becoming more and more clear, talking about hundreds and hundreds of years, right? So talking about 1 million years, 1 billion years. And so the opposite is true. If we think about primordial times, we could think of more of an isogamy presentations. And the more we evolve as species, then anisogamy or haploid cell gametes are the most evolutionary biology fitting presentation that we can find. So the opposite is true. We have a clear understanding that sex is binary. Now you might argue, okay, what about the rest? What about hormones? Same thing here. Science did not discover anything that we did not know already. Now, in terms of the function of those very hormones, we do know more things nowadays than we knew 10 years ago, 20 years ago. But the basics are still the same. When we think about estrogens, such as estradiol, when we think about androgens, we think about ovaries in the first case, and we think about testes in the second case. Okay. Now, of course, we know that we should investigate things such as progesterone more in depth. This is not the place to do that, although I would like to provide some references in this regard. And of course, androgens are not the only one. We should think of anti-malarial hormones, which some people might mistake with the anti-malaria. It's actually from Müller, from the research scientist Müller. So the Müller in English, kind of cognate of Müllner for the ones of you that are appreciative of Nordic or Germanic mythology and Thor. And from hormones, of course, we have genitalia, vagina, and penis. Binary, binary, binary. Now, this does not mean, however, that in the context of DSD or disorders of sex development, there is indeed a variation to this rule, to the binary rule. How are these variations presenting themselves in science? Well, a classical way to interpret this is, well, one thing that we can say about the binary sex encoding mechanism in humans is the fact that in terms of gametes, there is a binary that determines size, bigger for female, smaller for males, and I would say overall speed or stability, with stability in the first case for females and increased speed in the male. And this is, in terms of evolutionary biology, the best option for the possibility of multiple species to procreate and continue in their wonderful journey through life. And so big gametes that are more stable for females and fast-moving, smaller gametes for male.
All right, so what do we mean by sex from the perspective of science? This is really not about, I don't know how to define it, postmodernist, speculative argumentation. It really is pretty straightforward. And by straightforward, I do not mean to say that's easy to find out from a scientific standpoint, claiming that the scientific research is something that it's just predicated on, very superficial trial and error. No, the science is pretty complex, I would say, but at the same time, it's pretty clear in the way it's defined. What a sex is simply the number of distinct reproductive strategy in that specific species. That's it. And we are talking about gametes, of course. And when two gametes fuse, they form a genetically unique individual with a full set of chromosomes. That is pretty straightforward. Now, we did mention the difference between isogamy and anisogamy when we talk about mating types, but most species in the plant and animal kingdoms reproduce through gametes of different size and form. All right. So when we're talking about gametes, okay, think about haploid cells, there is an asymmetry both in size and behavior between the interacting gametes. All right. So smaller versus bigger size, and faster versus more stable form. And this is the representation of this binary function, or rather binary presentation of these reproductive strategies that we have in that species. So in terms of the biological definition, we have it, right? So what is the female sex? Is the adult phenotype that produces the larger gametes, okay, in the same system, this anisogamous system. And the male, of course, is the adult phenotype that produces the smaller gametes in the same system. And it's really the implementation of these strategies that is defined by sex, not just the external appearance of body types. And that's what's so important to understand, that we have a distribution, we have a variation within two pretty straightforward binary types, okay? This has nothing to do with the way a person perceives their social interaction. By nothing to do, again, we cannot skip biology. We cannot pretend that biology is not there. But when I'm saying it's nothing to do, we simply means that we cannot mix and match two different categories. One, I dare to say pseudo-etymological, and the other one fully biological. I'm sorry. Now, you might also make the point that this binary presentation should not be applicable to chromosomes only, because we mentioned there's XXY, there's XXXY, there are XXXX, etc. So it's not the XXXY, the chromosomes, that define what it means to be female and what it means to be male, okay? Because these sex determination mechanisms are the regulatory system that determine the path, right? The path that the organs will take eventually for their specific reproductive strategies, right? So this is, again, their sex. And plus, another issue is, okay, what about those individuals that do not fit into the XX and XY? Should we not consider them still within the binary sex presentation? Of course not. This individual will still develop either a large gamete, okay, large cell gamete, or a small fast gamete, okay? So small, of course, in the context of male, and large in the context of female, including those with XY, SRI genes, right? So it's exactly the same situation. Now, another criticism that can be made is, oh, well, you know, biology is much more complex than that, and it's not true that we can only have X or Y, including all this variation. So even if we want to acknowledge that as long as you have a Y chromosome, this could be used to identify the male individual, okay? So whether it's XY, XYY, XXY, or XXXY, even if you want to assume, and I don't really like the term, but you know, some people that don't really have that profound biological knowledge might claim, even if you want to believe that the Y, the existence of the Y, the activation of the SRY genes determines a male, and the opposite, if there is no Y, that means there is a female. What about other organisms? It's not true that we only have X or Ys in our karyotypes. What about those species with, I don't know, ZZ or ZW? How can we claim that this is true in biology? Wouldn't it be an oxymoron? And the answer to that question is, of course, no. So if the question is, how about ZZ, birds? Okay, what makes a bird with ZZ chromosomes male, and what does it mean that the female bird will have a ZW? Okay, well, the answer is, of course, going back to what sex actually means. So the male bird, a ZZ chromosome bird, will develop a small gamete reproductive strategy. And the ZW, of course, the opposite. And so we are still existing within this binary definition of sex. This is across the spectrum, no pun intended, in terms of species, and it's pretty straightforward in the scientific literature. Okay, I heard also other claims where there is a confusion between true hermaphrodites and the application of spurious term in the context of intersex. Well, thinking about leeches, for instance, where you have the existence of both female and male reproductive strategies, and yet again, this indeed proves the binary sex presentation. It's not an exception. If nothing else, it's a further demonstration of the binary. All right, okay, existence of two reproductive strategies at the same time. What about those species, crocodiles, I believe, that exist on, you could say, how can I say this, a spectrum, a wave of temperatures, right? And in crocodiles, within a certain range of temperature, males develop and females will develop within another range. In any case, the end result from their perspective of reproductive strategy is exactly the same. Okay, if you have 34 degrees Celsius, you will have a male individual. Okay, again, why? Because you find small gamete reproductive strategies. And if you have an individual, a crocodile individual, incubated at 30 degrees, well, you're going to see a large gamete reproductive strategy, and therefore you will see a female. So again, two reproductive strategies, two very distinct presentation. And again, in those species where you have the existence of both reproductive strategies, we cannot talk about a third sex, a third strategy, because we are talking about the existence of the same presentation, which is the binary presentation. And this is true for leeches, as we already mentioned. It's true for earthworms. And this has to do with the fact that the definition of hermaphrodites, which is really the definition of you could claim non-binary, although that too will be mistaken, because herma plus frodites, it's really a combination of the binary, so male and females, okay? But from a biological standpoint, it's not true, because a true hermaphrodite, biologically speaking, which will be the case of the earthworm and the leech, will possess a functioning male and female reproductive structure, okay? So this does not disprove it. Yet again, it's actually demonstrating that further. All right, how about another another species, hyenas, for instance. Some have claimed in some blogs quite recently that the female hyena is not really a female, because it has a different non-binary presentation. Well, the female hyena, it's not female because of a different presentation, which will be very sexist to claim, and applying sexism to a different species in itself can be a problematic statement. But in any case, it's nothing else but the fact that the hyena develops a large gamete reproductive strategies. Pretty straightforward. Okay, now there's also some misconception in surgery when we're talking about reconstruction, reassignment of either a vaginal structure to separate or to combine with another term that has to do with urethra. And this is really important because this mistake is being perpetrated in some pseudoscientific literature, not because it's anti-science, but because it doesn't really represent what the surgery is about in humans. In the case of a hyena, the penis-like structure is, again, a giant clitoris, okay? And it's confusing to the outside observer, I could say that, because it's a giant clitoris that a hyena uses to urinate, to copulate, as well as to give birth. So again, we are not talking about a third gender, because we are talking about the existence in some species of both reproductive strategies, or in the context of the female hyena, the existence of a phenotype that produces eggs. Now, this sexual dimorphism, and I would even remove the sexual element in this context, because it's not necessarily associated with reproduction itself, in the act itself, as I will discuss. It's a dimorphism that applies throughout the genetic structure. So you can see that at the level of the double helix of the DNA, you have two separate, two binary structure themselves. And so you might wonder, okay, well, so how about in practice? What's the likelihood that within a newborn there is a human being, newborn baby? It's hard to determine whether this person is a male or a female subject. Well, we could say that 1 every 2,000 individuals will have that presentation. And again, the interesting fact is that it's clear that the decision is made by experts, not by pseudo-philosophical, sociological discussions, okay? It's predicated upon everything we said today, not because of these lectures specifically, because that's what science clearly understands as binary. So between 0.2 to 2% of all human beings could be assigned by this very definition to the intersex group, okay? And again, we have to be very specific, because intersex is a much better definition than transgender or even transsexual, because it's more clear the direction that is predicated upon biology, okay? So within this group. Now, keep in mind that there are very, very straightforward genetic presentation that proves this point even further. So if we think about that, between, let's say, 200 and 300 genes, right? So about 15 through 25% of the individual DNA background, okay, plus the 58Y gene. So again, altogether about 300 genes, okay? This is what separates the typical adult male subject, the man, from the typical adult female subject, okay? And if you think about the 20,000 genes encoding for proteins that we're talking about here, we find that the difference, again, between male and female is about 1.5%. This is what the literature clearly understands as a fact. Studied thousands and thousands of times with plenty of replication and meta-analysis, pretty straightforward. So yes, when we're talking about the application of this statement in a social context, yes, absolutely, all right? we have more in common that we are different across species, but it turns out that a male has much more in common with another male from a very different background, a different countries, a different upbringing, a completely different phenotypical appearance. Those two individuals are much more closer. Again, a man born, with a typical, I would say, a phenotypical appearance from Northern Europe. Okay, thinking about tall, blonde, blue-eyed, and a male coming from, I don't know, a Central African ethnocultural group, for instance, with a phenotypical presentation. It's very, very different, dark hair, dark eyes, and so forth. Those two individuals will share much more genetic similarities than their respective female counterparts. So a female coming from the same ethnocultural area in Africa, and the female coming from the same geocultural tribal area in Northern Europe, say Scandinavia, for instance, or Fennoscandia. Okay, so the human being perspective, the human being as a species, shares about 99.9% of their genetic makeup. So they're identical. And yet, if you compare this with the difference between male and female, the similarity is really only up to 98.5%. Okay, and this really outside of the karyotypical conversation. So this difference doesn't even consider a difference in terms of X and Y distribution. We're talking about everything else. So this is pretty straightforward. So from the perspective of medicine, claiming that the unisex model is claiming that what is mistakenly perceived as tolerant, the model that wants male and female to be identical, from the perspective of medicine, is extremely risky. We couldn't be further separated. And that's specifically interesting and applicable because we had to develop very different therapeutic and pharmacological strategies, medical strategies, surgical strategies for that very, very reason. Okay, so the more we study, the more we have a clear idea of how different we are between male and female from the scientific standpoint. And this is really, really important. Now, but you might wonder, okay, well, what about the claim that someone can be asexual? Okay, well, what do we mean by asexual? Okay, now, when we think about asexual, we mean the absence of sexual. Okay, the privative a in Greek. Okay, so not to be confused with the Latin ad, for instance, right? Which is completely different meaning. We're not going to talk about it now. So yes, asexual individuals do exist indeed. Okay, we're talking about 1%. There's a difference between the way the statistical analysis has been conducted, but let's talk about 1% of the population that should be considered asexual in this context. Okay, by asexual we simply mean an individual that does not have an attraction from this perspective, okay, to the opposite sex. Okay, so it's both socially and biologically understood as such. So yes, they do exist, and they are to be understood within that specific perspective. So these cannot be misinterpreted really without a pretty straightforward understanding of basic math at this point as the indication of a spectrum. No, binary sexual presentation, it's not a variation of a spectrum, okay? Because 99% of all human beings are indeed male and female, period. Now, we could continue our conversation. So, okay, what about other species? If you want to go back, we talked about earthworms, we talked about leeches, we talked about crocodiles, I believe. How about clownfish? This is something that I also hear from time to time in the literature. So, can the sex of a clownfish be determined in a specific way, or as a specific way as in humans? Yes, of course, because when we're talking about clownfish, yes, they do have the ability to switch, right? They change between sexes, right? And but the sex of accomplishment can still be determined despite of disability, because we're still looking at their reproductive strategies that they have currently implemented. So they switch, but it doesn't create a third presentation. They simply switch between these two binaries, okay? Or the SLAC, for instance, exactly the same thing. In the SLAC, you have the male and female reproductive strategies, but you can find it in the same individual, okay? So just as we said about the presentation in the leeches or the earthworms, they have a phenotype that can produce both sperm and eggs. Now, to continue, when we're thinking about this overall presentation, can we say that this is only a question of sexual investigation, so to speak? So it does not apply to anything else beyond genetics, despite the fact that we are indeed, to a very big extent, determined by our genetics. Can something else be said about the way we appear? Okay, because you might say, well, this is all good from the perspective of what lies underneath, but phenotype and genotype don't necessarily match, right? So is there anything similar that we can observe? And the answer is straightforward, yes. In most cases, in the vast majority of cases, again, talking about the same percentages we talked so far, a random individual with no medical training whatsoever could identify the person as either female or male in exactly the same percentage of cases, okay? And why is that? Well, because we have very different presentations. So, for instance, statistically speaking, the male presentation has much broader shoulders than the female, for instance, and they have broader backs, for instance, in comparison to the female counterpart. They also present with a much more a much stronger muscle mass and a reduced adipose tissue, for instance, the way they're interacting in terms of the way they deambulate, for instance, right? The very gait is completely different. And by the way, the fact that they walk differently not only indicates a very different structure on the level of osteology, so that their bones are very different. Okay, the bone density is different, etc., etc. But the fact that their muscle mass is much more, it's much stronger and more developed in terms of size and power, you know, and because their muscles contain many mitochondria, well, you know, the oxygen consumption is also higher, okay, because you have to sustain the muscle of the male. So just by looking at it, it's very different. So this in turn constitutes a very easy to verify difference in metabolic rate. It's the law of Kleiber, for instance. And so sure, we could not just base our scientific knowledge on what it's perceived to be true, but if you have a straightforward not just random similarity, but identical presentation in all the areas, biology, endocrinology, neurology, common sense / common perception, all the way to etymology, well, to make the claim that the binary is not true and everything's on a spectrum becomes not only very difficult to defend as a claim, it becomes an absurd claim, a completely anti-scientific claim. And by the way, this is true for a variety of things in terms of the overall size of male and female. So and you know, there are plenty of studies indicate that. So between 6 and 11%, so the average mathematical average is about 8% bigger physical presentation in males as in female. And so what does that mean? That we have no major problem in recognizing what the sex we are observing now is within this binary spectrum. Also, we talked this before, neurogenetically speaking, we have significant difference the way the female brain develops, both in terms of speed of development and specific functions, and the male one. And also, overall, when we're talking about growth in general, from the perspective of human growth and development in general, not just in terms of the brain, young females are pretty much already developed around the age of 17. So, roughly speaking, 17 and a half, depending what meta-analysis you're looking at. But for males, we have to wait until the 21st, 22nd birthday to have a clear presentation when it comes to their full body development. Okay, and by the time they reach 21 and a half or so, they reach their the end of their bodily development. So those are all pretty straightforward indication that there is a consistent sequence, we could say, between what happens at the level of what's inside, we could say, chromosomes, gonads and gametes, hormones, genitalia, neurotransmitters, brain function, brain anatomy, etc., and what can be perceived as the outside component. Furthermore, when we're thinking about hormones, okay, we have to identify the different cycles between males and females, where male subjects have a constant fertility or opportunity for fertility, so 24 hours from roughly 15 through the age of 15 through 85, versus for women, the rhythm is different. So you have a constant fertility for males, okay, 24-hour clock, similar to what happens between the two archetypes, right? The sun and the moon, right? The sun cycle and the moon cycle, despite the fact that etymologically speaking, in for instance, Romance languages see the sun as male and the moon as female, and in Germanic languages it's the other way around. But in any case, in the adult male subject, we're talking about a constant fertility between the age of 15 through 85, roughly speaking, on average, versus for women, we're talking about 15 through 45, but again, 12 per month, right? So the cycle is different, and it's nothing to do with socially constructed perspective. In fact, we could even make the claim, based on several studies, that there is that similarity in the cycle in the presence of multiple adult females in the room. And by adult, we mean biologically speaking, not legally speaking. So females that do have a functional reproductive strategies, and they experience that. So this is even more indication of the importance of biology, right? And so what does it mean? That overall, female subjects are fertile for about 30 years in human species, versus male subjects about 70 years on average, all things considered, without taking into account other medical comorbidities that, of course, have nothing to do, from this perspective, with genetic makeup, okay? Because we already talked about how within DSDs, the infertility rate is entirely predicated upon the development of the DSD itself, not in regard to other variables. Okay, one more point, kind of to sum up what we said so far. Well, okay, sex is binary. There is no possible way to demonstrate that this is not true, but there's nothing to do with gender yet again, especially because within gender, we talk about gender identity. Okay, so those things are completely different. And they do not match, or they don't have to match necessarily. If they do match, it's because they just match, or because society or social norms want them to match. Well, this is also not true, and we can also make this claim. So if we have other categories or claimed categories beyond male and female, that we mentioned, the situation in certain countries, like just Egypt and Turkey and Dominican Republic. We mentioned the Katu in Thailand, etc. We can also mention the Toms in Thailand and the Metis in Nepal, the Hijras in India, or the Fafins in Samoa, etc. Does that mean that this beyond male and female gives birth to, no pun intended, to a spectrum of gender or spectrum of gender identity? Well, when talking about gender identity, and again, we have to understand what gender identity means, and please review, if you don't mind, if you feel like, actually, the history of the development of the term itself, and you can find the exact same situation in other languages. Think about Geschlechtsidentität, for instance, in German. So anyway, gender identity is over 99% of all human beings, okay, still constructed within the binary norm, okay? So chromosomal, and then, of course, structure over gonads, hormones, genitalia, and so on. So with the activation or not of the SRY genes, and plus or minus the presence of testosterone, okay? So this is true even in utero, okay? So even in utero, there is the clear understanding, biologically speaking, and we're already talking about the, starting 8 weeks, okay? We're not talking about the end of term, right? End of gestation, 8 weeks. This is already clear. There are 2 sexes, and then you have 2 sexes plus what we could view as intersex because of variations, modifications, genetic mistake. Again, this should not be interpreted as an attack or a negative moral connotation. It's just a genetic mistake in the sense that it's a mutation of the genes, okay? So in any case, this is straightforward. Now, from the perspective of genetics, this is also indicative that we have a clear idea of what's going on. Plus, when we're thinking about this supposed 3rd or 4th or 5th category beyond male and females in the ethnoculturals, minorities we just mentioned, those individuals are still males and females, but their presentation, in this sense, their identity, okay, their non-identity as defined as a 3rd or more category, but identity as in variation of expression, okay? They see themselves in a different way, okay? Now, sure, some of them can be perceived as 3rd categories simply because society might have a resistance, and we have to understand that there is a unfortunate moralization of things that should just be understood from the perspective of biology. It has nothing to do with improper moral behavior, okay? And also the result of sex stereotypes. But personal identity, yet again, does not define sex. It's quite the other way around. So personal identity and personal gender expression represent what evolutionary biology actually shows. So it's the expected variation within, again, this binary presentation, male and female.
Now, we talked about disorders of sex development, and I do understand that every time we talk about disorders, we have to be careful not to mix and match the way we use a term in science from the way we use a term in the public discourse. The term disorder simply means that something is not in order, and who or what gives us the natural order? Again, let me restate that in the lab, we should remove as much as we can any possible bias that originates in either pseudo-philosophical speculation, spirituality, or religion, because we should focus on what we can demonstrate in the lab. So an order, in this case, based on nature, and nature investigated by the scientific method. I do understand that claiming that nature can only be investigated by the scientific method could be interpreted as arrogant, but just because something is arrogant, it does not make it false. And plus, arrogant is more of a quality that is pertaining to this or that individual, not to the method itself. We cannot claim that the scientific method is arrogant, unless we want to take into account the etymology of the term, in terms of rogare. And in that sense, it should be arrogant. It should be a way to really dig deep into the thing we want to discover. But in any case, this order of sex development have absolutely nothing to do with the moral judgment of the people affected by it. Plus, we could use other terms such as diverse sex development or differences in sex development. Things will not really change because each of these terms represents a variation from what? From the natural norm. Natural, as in biologically based, evolutionary based, I would say, and even scientifically method based norm.